write a mystery series that is set in 1920s India. And it features a woman called Perveen Mystery, and she's a young woman lawyer living in India, living with her family, and the only place that she can practice law is in her father's firm because nobody, of course, wants to hire a woman lawyer because of the sexism of the time. And a number of people have asked me how realistic this situation is. And when I was doing research about India's history, I've always been looking for what women have done, whether it was working as a teacher, working as a writer, working as a doctor. And I had come across information that starting in the 1890s, there was a woman lawyer practicing in India. In fact, she was the first woman lawyer in the whole British Empire. And her name was Cornelia Sarabji, and she left wonderful memoirs about the work she did. So I've been asked if there are any authors in the past or present that inspired me. So I would say that in the past, I really enjoy a writer who produced a lot in the 1950s called Josephine Tay, who's a British writer. She's written a lot of really terrific mysteries, and her writing is so elegant. I can never guess who did it in her books. I love to read her work. I read a lot of people that are currently writing, contemporary writers. If you're interested in more Indian mysteries, there's a writer called Abir Mukherjee who is published in Britain and the United States and India. And he writes mysteries that are set in the 1920s, but in Calcutta. So I feel like we're kind of like these cousins on different sides. And he has an Indian detective in who's working with the British controlled police, and of course I have my lady lawyer. So we'll see if they ever connect, as we've been happy to connect at some mystery conventions. Advice to new writers, because I wonder if there's anybody here who is thinking about writing a novel. I would say that being in a writer's group was was a confidence builder for me. I began my fiction writing career having been a journalist before, And that's what I had done, and I was used to working for a salary and being very comfortable with that. And so the idea of just completely going out on my own and typing by myself in this solitary world is really it was hard. And I started it, but I was moving very slowly. So what I did was I became part of a writing critique class, which was led by a teacher. It was a night school class in my area. By then, I was moved back to Baltimore, Maryland, and this was at Johns Hopkins. And I got so much out of the class because it was the first time that anybody said, "This is interesting," because I didn't believe my own work was interesting. So that class also pushed me to produce. So I found for me that a class was very helpful. Sometimes you might be able to join an organization like Sisters in Crime, which is open to anybody who supports, the mission of promoting women writers, but we help each other. And I later on became part of a small critique group that was a few Sisters in Crime members from my chapter. I think with the online world, it's completely possible to have that kind of a setting.
But talk about Praveen because she's so unique.
Well, thank you. I feel like she's very real to me. I write this mystery series now. It's set in 1921 Bombay, and I'm going to be in that year for a long time. I'm stretching things out. She has lawyers are busy. Perveen is the first woman lawyer in Bombay, and her lifestyle and the kind of cases she's involved in are inspired by the experiences of India's first two women lawyers who were active. One of them started practicing in the 1890s and one of them in the 20s. And I sort of established that Perveen is working with her father after having had an Oxford education in the first book, The Widows of Malabar Hill. And in this one, she goes a little bit afield, just like Aimee goes afield out of her neighborhood. Perveen actually goes into these beautiful mountains that are about 2 hours outside of Bombay, now Mumbai. There are a lot of these hill stations there. And in the old days, there were places, the British would have their postings there, but also there were a whole lot of these little princely states that were actually ruled by Maharajas rather than the British. However, they had to be in cooperation with the government. I've always been fascinated by royalty. When I was a little girl, I thought I was a princess who had been kidnapped. I don't know if anybody else ever told their parents that when they didn't like what their parents were saying, but that was usually what I would tell them and why I didn't want to do something. So I had my own opinion of how wonderful it would be to be a princess. But when I actually began going to places, like I went and I stayed at a palace in Rajasthan that had turned part of its complex into, a hotel using the original guest wing. And, I went in and I toured the areas where the women used to stay in seclusion. The royal women, I realized it was just such a claustrophobic existence. And I looked more and more into the lives of royal women and royal children, and I wanted to tell this story. My India, it's my father is born in India during the period when the British were still in power. And I began going to India. I only went as a visitor, like as a family child visitor, starting in the 1970s, which was really only 25 years after the British had left. So there was like this gigantic hangover of Britain there with all the children's books were British. Like there was not much television. There was just the kind of British foods in the hotels, and one reason that I set this series in Bombay is it was the city in India where women became professionals first. This was largely part because of a minority religious community that were headquartered in Bombay, and these are the Parsis. They are Zoroastrians who were born in India, and the Zoroastrians were I'm going to call them Parsis from this point on. They were more interested in they wanted to get along with the British because they were doing fabulous business deals with them. And so they began looking at, well, if the British are saying that women can be, going to universities and doing these things, we are going to want to send our daughters to Oxford, and so that they are keeping pace. And so it was a little bit of a status thing that Parsi parents wanted their daughters to become not just teachers, but principals and professors and doctors and lawyers.
Highly educated.
Well, I'm going to address that thing about the film first because it's like I am on the phone every week about it. So I've had a lot of offers, but the question is taking the right offer, because what often happens is they love your book and they want to take it, but they want to have control over the character and write their own stories. And there's nothing more. I would absolutely love to have a mini series or like a digital TV, which is what most of these offers are for that. But I feel very strongly that I want India to be represented correctly. And I've spent so many years learning about colonial India and about, Muslims and Parsis. And I just can't imagine that like a group of people sitting in Hollywood will be able to do that right. Like it's either I've got it, they can work with my books or I can be a writer on it. So it's like, it's just an ongoing. And so right now I'm still in a discussion, but there have been many, many, many no's, unfortunately. Like from a practical point of view, if you want to write, especially about another place where you don't live, whether it's across another state or another country, before I go to that place, I reach out and I arrange interviews. Like I find out about people who know about things. Like, for example, I found out about this person who's a real police buff, who really interested in the history of police. So I make those appointments ahead of time. And then the other thing is I try to take offbeat walking tours. There's so many good offbeat walking tours now, and that when you're on foot with a person, and they will often veer and take you somewhere else, and you learn and you can ask questions. I mean, that's how I learned a lot about Muslim women's lives, is that I walked around Bombay with somebody from that culture.
How do you deal with, that is a great one. How do you deal with modern sensibility in your historical fiction?
Yeah, that's tricky because I can't have, Perveen Mysteries say, what the F are you doing not letting me into this room or something, she cannot do that. So I try to always remember how people did behave in society, but I can try to express that, maybe how her anxiety and her feeling of disappointment might physically manifest for her. And so then you kind of understand what's going on, because even though she can't actually understand that, she doesn't understand that what's bad is the same way that we understand it, because there haven't been these expectations and changes of law. But she can feel these things, and we can feel them with her. And she can also try to use the existing law to get what she can for her female clients, because she can't change the law.